Hi, and welcome. And real quick, the Podcast Engineering School, the online training program, is starting on April 4th. Go to the website for all the details, podcastengineeringschool.com. That's right, it's going to be online training. Barry, you like online training, right?
Yeah, oh yeah.
I thought so. So check out the website for more information, podcastengineeringschool.com. Okay, hey, before we start, Barry, I got a question for you. Zack Hanni is on the show today, and he owns a recording studio where he records music and bands and audio production. Since he's not a podcaster, do you think he can add value to this show?
No way. You crazy?
Come on! Oh, wrong button.
Come on,
Hold
Barry. Come on.
Hold on, Barry. Do you think Zach can add value to the show, Barry?
Yeah, oh yeah.
That's right, he can, because this is the Podcast Engineering Show. Wait a second, Chris. Hold on. Don't forget to tell them about Podcast Engineering School. It's happening the first week of April 2nd to the 7th, with the pre-webinar starting March 9th. The January pricing discount is ridiculous. Ridiculous. Don't forget to tell them to go to podcastengineeringschool.com. This is the Podcast Engineering Show session. This is actually session number 40. Let's do it. Here's my band. Come on. That's right. We're back. Welcome to the show. Wow, that was a little radio voicey, right? That was getting a little goofy here.
Welcome to the show.
Right, but welcome. I'm Chris Curran. I'm the founder of the Podcast Engineering School, and this is the Podcast Engineering Show. I actually produce podcasts for the likes of Forbes, Dun & Bradstreet, and select business authors and companies. And this week, on this show, every week we bring you experts. And it's not as far as podcasting goes, it's not as far as the marketing or the listeners or the content on the show. It's all about the audio engineering side of podcasting. It's how to get your show to sound really good, how to learn the audio engineering techniques and tricks that will avoid your will have you avoid having your show. Was that a sentence? It'll avoid your show sounding like crap, basically. All right. So I have a background in audio engineering in the music business, and since I entered podcasting almost 5 years ago now, I noticed most podcasters don't have any real skills in the audio engineering side of this, and they just kind of wing it, and it works pretty well for most people, but some people really want to take their sound to the next level. They have a sound, they're not quite happy, and that's why you can listen to the show. So if you implement the best of what you learn here, your show will sound way better, and you'll be able to produce your shows in less time. And time is the big thing, actually, right, Zach? Time,
yes.
Production time can kill you, right?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, it's unbelievable. Of course, Barry's here with me.
Yeah, oh yeah.
He's the maintenance guy in my old building in New Jersey, which, by the way, I went to New Jersey, for Thanksgiving. I keep forgetting. We're recording this in December, but it's going to go out on January 19th. So, hello, welcome. It's January 19th. Welcome to the show. Anyway, I was in New Jersey for Thanksgiving, and I went by my old building to see if I could, see Barry, and he wasn't there. And I kind of waited around. I poked my head into, there's 4 buildings. I poked my head into each one, and I was like, I kind of waited. I went real slow because I thought he might just walk around the corner, but I didn't get to see him. So
get some new recordings from him.
Right? Actually, I didn't have my
field
mic.
Recorder. Oh, okay.
No, I didn't.
That would have been funny.
Yeah. I kind of wanted just to see Barry. You know what? I never really followed him around. My old co-host, David Deutsch, we did a show called Social Media Unscrambled. He used to tell people, oh, Chris follows Barry around with a mic. And I never did that. He would come into the studio and he just wanted to take a break. He was an older guy, and he just wanted to sit and chat. He told the best stories because he was a seaman. He was on ships his whole life and sailed around the world and visited so many countries. And the stories this guy could tell was remarkable. And he would come in and sit down. So I got in the habit of I would slowly set up a mic stand, and then I'd grab a mic, and then I'd run a cable. And literally over 10 minutes, I'd have a mic in front of him, and I'd just hit record.
Have you actually interviewed him? Sit down and have a full interview?
I did not. No, I didn't. A lot of the times he would sit and chat. It was us chatting about stories and stuff. I wasn't actually interviewing him, but he would share stories from his past. I kind of wanted him. He had such a great voice. I was like, Barry, come into the studio on a Saturday and I'll pay you. I'll pay you well to come in and just say some things or read some things. And he was like, oh, okay. Like, he just didn't take it seriously. We used to tell him with Social Media Unscrambled, we're like, Barry, you're like a mini celebrity. Everybody loves your voice, you know? Yeah, oh yeah. And he's like, he would laugh. He didn't even know what we were talking about. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, he's just such a humble guy. Like, he didn't even know. Anyway, that's Barry. Quick announcement. Podfest Multimedia Expo is next month. It's February 23rd to 25th in Orlando. I'm going to be there speaking, and it's going to be great. There's going to be wonderful people there, a lot of great speakers. It's one of the most well-done events I've ever been to, period. And I'm not even exaggerating. Chris and Katie Kremitzotz are just wonderful people. They put on the best event, Podfest Multimedia Expo. It's not too late to get your ticket and go. You'll learn everything about podcasting, and you can hang out with me and all the other podcasting meatheads and all this stuff. The other thing is Lexington, Kentucky in April. I'm keynoting at the podcasting course, which is the first course designed for podcasters in medical education. So if you know anyone in medical education or a medical field podcast, send them to thepodcastingcourse.com. That's the website, thepodcastingcourse.com. It's April 21st to 22nd, 2017 in Lexington, Kentucky. Come on, when's the last time you've been to Lexington? Live a little. All right. And of course, our show is available everywhere you hear a podcast. And I'm going to do a future show about my new programs, the RX5 and the Ozone 7. But I'm building up to that.
Ooh,
today,
I'm excited about that.
Oh, dude. Do you have either one of those?
I have Ozone 6, and I was using 5 and 6, so I haven't tested out 7 yet, but I'm excited about it.
Right, it has a couple vintage, like, analog, quote, analog modules, which, to me, it just makes a difference from the way I was mastering until the way I'm doing it now with Ozone 7. It really, it makes a difference. I'm still figuring out release times on the multiband compressor. I don't know if I should keep all the release times the same over the 4 bands, or if I should, for the mid-range, make the release time less or more.
I think it's fair, as just a rough estimate. The lower frequencies, you can get away with it being longer, with the higher frequencies, you tend to want it to be a bit shorter. Just as a rule of thumb, it really depends on the track.
That makes sense because, that makes sense. So I'm going to mess with that. I still have to mess with it. That's the thing. You buy new software, it takes time to mess with it.
It does.
You just, and it's not like you can say, okay, literally on a Saturday, I'm going to sit down for 10 hours and knock it all out. That's actually not good. You need to do 1 hour here, 2 hours there, 3 days later, do another hour. It's the coming back to it that gives you the perspective, and right? Would you say that, Zach?
Especially with multiband compression, like that's a whole nother world compared to just regular compression.
Right, so we're going to talk about that. Zack Hanni, you are the owner of Soma Recording Studios.
Yes, I am.
Soma, S-O-M-A, Soma Recording Studios. Is there a song by Smashing Pumpkins named Soma?
There's many songs named Soma.
Okay.
But I know of the Smashing Pumpkins. I know, also I was a big fan of Deadmau5, who had a song named Soma.
Oh wow, never heard of Deadmau5.
And I forget the name of the book now, but there's a book involving some drug named Soma, which I was also reading at the time when I came up with the name Soma.
Oh, it's a drug?
Yeah, well, it's just meant to make you a bit loopy, like you go on vacation in the book.
So
I
see.
They make you take this drug.
Oh, it's a fictional drug. I see.
Yeah. It's
So,
well, I don't know. It might actually exist. I think I heard of it existing somewhere.
All right. Well, if Zach comes across that, it'll be in the show notes. You're in the Philadelphia area, and here's the thing. Like I said jokingly in the beginning with Barry, that you are not a podcaster yet, right? Am I correct? Okay.
Well, I've been meaning to get into podcasting, but things have been a bit delayed as of late because I've had to move locations. Right. And the business is just growing right now, so I haven't really had the time to commit to it. But I have plans for a podcast at some point. Right.
And you're like me. You're an audio engineer guy, so literally, the production side of podcasting is just going to be a snap. Like it's.
Oh yeah.
That's all. That's the advantage we have. Anyway, you also went to Middle Tennessee State University and you majored in audio production.
I did.
And you actually minored in entertainment technology. But the audio production major is, again, you're in the recording studios, you're learning all the theory about audio and electricity and microphone, everything, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Everything.
That's really cool. So, by the way, the podcast engineering school program that I'm going to run, it's going to be a week long. And it's going to be a small class. I don't know if it's a class, it's a program. Not many students, and we're going to learn everything having to do with podcast production, including going into some of the audio engineering theory and EQ and compression. We're going to go deep into everything. But the cool thing is, after 1 week, you'll receive a certificate that says you're a certified podcast engineer, because you'll know all the necessary things. Like everything Zach and I learned, you don't need to know everything.
Yeah, you really don't.
You need to know a fair amount, for sure, to be an exceptional podcast engineer. Like, again, the release times on a multi-band compressor, Things like that. Little things that the novice would never even think of. All right, so Zach, you're on the show today. I wanted to have you on to talk about EQ and compression. These are topics that are covered. Actually, they're not really covered that much on podcasting shows. However,
they should be. They're really important.
Yeah, they're really important. But I want to start with something. If you listened to last episode, when I was speaking with Max Flight, he has a new mic preamp, and on it is a switch for impedance. I mentioned that on a future episode, I'll come back and explain what impedance is. And I've briefly mentioned that, for instance, plugging in instruments is one level of impedance, and like microphones are another level. So I asked Zach if he would Zach, can you just give us a quick little overview of what impedance is, and maybe, and then after what it is, we'll talk about how it relates to podcasters.
I am not an expert on signal impedance, but my understanding is that it's basically just signal resistance. So things like lav mics, very small mics, or like guitars have really high impedance. So you might have to switch like a high Z or an instrument switch on your interface, just so like the impedance and that level matches to what it's expecting in the preamp.
Got it, right. So if it's a small mic or like an instrument, a guitar or a bass guitar, when you plug the guitar straight into a mic.
Yeah, like an electric guitar, like not necessarily an acoustic, but
right. So, and high Z, you mentioned that sometimes there's a switch for high Z. That means high impedance.
Yes. Yeah, it has different names. Instrument, high Z, or it might just say impedance switch on your device.
Right. It might just say instrument. That's right. Actually, on my
mine just says instrument.
2i2. Yeah, it says. Actually, on my Focusrite 2i2, it says there's a switch between line and instrument. Right? So instrument means you're plugging in a guitar.
Yes.
So really, in terms of impedance, it's really when you plug instruments directly into a mic pre, that's high impedance. Basically, all microphones are low impedance, right? Or regular, right?
Low impedance. So I think the regular microphone is around 600 ohms, which is considered low.
Okay. So in terms of podcasters, you most likely will never come across this. I mean, you won't have to use it. I mean, obviously, you're not going to plug a mic in and switch the switch to instrument. That doesn't make sense because you're plugging in a mic. So you probably never have to deal with it.
Well, you might hit it by accident if you're trying to turn on phantom power.
Oh, that's right.
Just be aware that they are different buttons. The 48V button, phantom power, is definitely different than the instrument or high Z button.
Right. And of course, just a reminder, the phantom power is it sends power from the mic preamp to the mic, because the mic and it's condensers usually, right? It's always condensers.
Yep.
That actually need some power to operate. So that's what 48 volts does. It travels from the mic preamp through the mic cable, right? And goes to the mic itself and gives the mic a little bit of power, and that allows the mic to do its job, to change the sound into electrical impulses. Right? That's cool. So yeah, impedance, it's not a big deal. And I wonder, I mean,
I don't have to work with it very often. it's really rare because in my interface, I just plug the guitars directly in, just push instrument. Like I don't need a DI box or anything for the most part.
Right. So just so everyone understands that, I was going to just ask you about direct boxes. A direct box is basically a box that changes the impedance of a signal, right?
Yep.
So you plug, for instance, you plug a guitar straight into a direct box, and then you come out of the direct box, and then you go into the mic pre or wherever you're going.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's what a direct box is. There you go. Well, that's helpful, and I don't know if the impedance switch would change the sound at all. Like, what if, because I never really played with it, but what if you plugged a mic in, but you switched it to instrument? I mean, would it blast the level out, or would it?
I don't think good things would happen. But if you do have a guitar plugged in, it might sound really thin unless you click the instrument button. So if you do need to have, the instrument button pressed, then you should hear a difference between it being off and on.
Right, and that's good to know.
For things that it's meant to be for. But if you plug it, if you're just trying to experiment, I know accidentally I left the instrument on, the high Z button on when I was playing one of my synthesizers, and it totally just like the left channel was totally just blown out and like really distorted. But it kind of sounded cool, so I ended up leaving it in the track. So complete mistake, but hey, it worked.
And that happens so much in music studios, right? There's you do something wrong, or you plug in a mic and the mic pre is all the way up and it's like nasty distortion, and you're like, ooh, let's double the vocal with that sound real quick. Laid out all these different tracks with weird sounds, because in music that helps shape the character of the track. Instead of everything being crystal clear and clean and everything you'd expect, sometimes it's good to experiment and get a wacky sound that is going to catch people's ear, or just be different enough to sound, maybe original or unique, right?
Exactly, yeah. Like if it catches my ear, I'm considering throwing it in the track.
Right, so again, that really doesn't apply to podcasting, but just a little good to know. All right, so let's get into EQ and compression. EQ is something that, honestly, I've talked to. There are some podcast producers, engineers, who actually do it for a living, mostly part-time. They might edit a couple shows, or they might do things, they might record a couple shows, edit a few shows. Might not be their full-time gig, but I've heard of several, at least 2 or 3, that don't even use EQ at all.
Wow, you should be using EQ on every single track.
Right? Explain that, Zach.
Well, for me, like no matter what I'm recording, everything has some amount of like low end that maybe you don't want. So even in the vocal, I'm gonna cut, I don't know, maybe below 100 hertz or so. But over time, as you record, maybe you have like 20 tracks, 20, 30 tracks on a song. You want to cut off all that low end, otherwise it's just going to build up and create it's going to create some mud and allow the low end, like the bass or the kick drum that you want to be clear. It's going to muddy that up, so it's going to be, it's just going to sound like it's boom, boom, boom.
Yeah, really thuddy, muddy.
Yeah.
So in terms of podcast voices, let's say there's 2 voices on a podcast, or even 3 voices.
Well, in podcasts, I think I would use EQ more to, I guess, match the voices. Like if maybe one guy's talking really close to the mic and a lot of bass is picking up, and the other guy has a mic that doesn't necessarily have a lot of bass, you might want to match to it. So
right.
You might want to cut some bass or add some bass to the other guy's voice, just a little bit of low end.
Yeah, one of the things I've heard recently is when there are a couple voices, some voices are crystal clear. Like, for instance, I know my voice with the setup I have here, my voice is crystal clear. Like, it's just, boom. This is like, boom. That's all I have to say. But other voices, you might record someone on Skype, or on Skype when they're on the phone kind of thing, and they're just not clear enough. There's not enough clarity. So how would you make someone more clear?
More clear?
Intelligible.
It depends on what more clear means, because if let's say they're talking on a phone where it's basically a bandpass filter that the phone company's putting on so that the signal traveling up to the satellites is smaller. So they're cutting off all the low end and all the high end.
Right.
So if I were to try to make it a bit clearer, I might boost around 3K or something, or just put a high shelf EQ and maybe a low shelf just to bring up the extreme high and low end to make it sound like maybe a little bit more close to the full range that you'd get from a normal mic recording.
Yeah, that's definitely, adding the presence around 3K. And it's funny, Skype, if you do the phone calls through Skype, which, by the way you do that is on Skype, you just add some money. Like you can add $10 or $20 onto your Skype account, and then you can basically call worldwide anywhere, and it's cheap. So it's kind of cool. Like if you don't have a phone box, like a digital hybrid is what they're called, which is like a separate piece of equipment, which is not cheap to hook up to your mixer. You can make calls through Skype just by adding money and then dialing a number. But right, Skype cuts off the high end. In fact, I just got the Isotope RX5 software, and it not only has the waveform on the screen, it has the spectral analysis on the screen. So you can see the frequencies, and you can just see that Skype cuts off the high end. So sometimes it's actually difficult to get more high end from a Skype signal and have it sound, clear and crisp instead of sounding like annoying. It's difficult because it's just not there.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
I mean, there's only so much. So the point is, there's only so much you can do. You can try to make a Skype call more present. And actually, one of the tricks I often do is, you can add 3K and add high end to add presence, but you can also find that frequency in the low mids where there's a lot of warmth. Oh, and here's my phone ringing. Sorry about that.
I guess for me, it all depends on what I'm hearing. Because a lot of programs are different, whether you're recording from Skype or recording directly from someone's phone or using like Google Voice or something. They all use different algorithms and stuff and however they're compressing. So I guess it really depends on, what I'm hearing.
Right.
Yeah, like if you do need to boost like the low mid-range, and if that makes it more present, then yeah.
Well, actually, I go the opposite way. I actually take out some low mid. So
okay.
Yeah, there's that warmth. There's that like warmth / the low mids is just to me it is the most interesting band of the spectrum, the low mids. Let's say from 300 to 600 or 700, whatever, somewhere in there. It's such a
that's a challenge in there.
Right? It's so weird.
That is.
So the mid-range is the most important part of a sound. Well, especially when it comes to voices. We're talking about voices for podcasting. The mid-range is it. Yeah, but the low mids, sometimes there's too much, sometimes there's too little. So my point is that if you need more presence, if you need more clarity from a voice, you can add more high end, but you can't add too much because then it gets brittle and it sounds harsh. So you can add some of that, but then if it's still not present enough, you can go into the low mids and find one of those kind of warm frequencies that's adding like more of the body, the warmth, and just take a little out. And if you take a little of that out, relatively speaking, there'll be more high end, more presence, right?
Yeah, I suppose. So it's not going to add any extra. It's just going to make the higher frequencies that are there more noticeable. So you can like cut the low end or boost the high end. It's going to do kind of the same thing in a way.
Yeah, exactly. That's the whole balancing act of EQ, right?
Yeah. Yeah, you can either boost the frequencies that you want to add or just cut the frequencies that you don't want to add. You can achieve the same result either way. You may just have to have some makeup gain if you're cutting.
Right. So makeup gain, what you're talking about is if you cut enough of the signal, the overall signal gets very low. So after the EQ processes it, there's a makeup gain at the end where you boost the level back up to where it should be.
Yeah, a lot of EQs, like I use Ableton Live, the one I have, has a gain. I guess you can add gain or reduce gain at the end stage of the EQ.
Right, that's always helpful. Yeah, so it definitely is a balancing act of, adding EQ and subtracting EQ. I often hear, and it's actually true, that as far as EQing, it's better to attenuate some frequencies than to boost.
Yes.
Yeah, explain that. Why is it better to, instead of always adding, that's the novice's go-to. It's like, oh, I need more presence, I'm going to add 3K, or I need it to sound more warmer, I'm going to add low end. Whereas the professional or the person with experience might not always add, they might subtract. Why is subtracting frequencies technically better?
Well, I feel like for the most part, if you are adding frequencies in small amounts, you're not even going to notice the difference, especially for maybe something like a podcast. I really feel like the untrained ear isn't even going to notice the difference. But if you are boosting, then it might add a little bit of, I guess, some phase problems. I'm not sure, like maybe some like minor like distortion issues, but it's really inaudible unless you're going really crazy with the EQ.
Right.
It's just a good practice to just cut. I mean, I've developed that practice of cutting instead of adding frequencies.
Right. So the way an EQ works, and I'm sure you know this, Zach, is it actually, the way it boosts frequencies is by phasing. It'll phase, for instance, if you want to boost 3K, the EQ will somehow phase out, it'll swap the phase and cut out everything except that 3K range, and then it'll boost it. Right? So the way an EQ works is it phases different bands of the frequency to either add it or to add it. But subtracting, it does the same thing, but you're subtracting any of that phase, those artifacts or that phasing that happens. If you're attenuating a frequency, you're actually lowering that effect.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So that's generally why it's better to attenuate frequencies instead of adding them.
Right. Talk to me about extreme EQing. Maybe so you produce music, so let's talk about like vocal tracks. Like when you go to EQ a vocal, did you ever have to use any extreme EQ, or tell me about that?
Yeah. So sometimes people will send me tracks that they recorded at their own home studio, and I guess the recordings might be less than ideal, let's say.
Right.
So they might be using like a USB mic or just a really cheap microphone, or like an SM57 or something where a lot of the high end isn't there, or it's just a really dark recording. Sometimes I'll have to be a bit more extreme and boost it, have like a high shelf, just boosting everything maybe like above 1 or 3K or 5K, just boosting the whole high end just to really bring it out, because otherwise their vocal just sounds incredibly dark. You can also add a bit of, I've learned a trick that adding a bit of distortion to vocals, like very tiny percents, like 2 to 5% as far as your dry wet goes. So it's barely in there, but it adds some natural sounding higher frequencies where sometimes, if there aren't any, having some overdrive or distortion will add those. So it kind of makes up for it. So I've done things like that as well to help bring it up, make it a bit more brighter and more present in the mix.
That's a cool trick. I'm writing that one down. Yeah, certainly adding it very slightly to get the high-end presence or just some of that feel. That's a cool trick.
Yeah, it'll add high frequencies where, like you said, like Skype, like they don't exist. They're not present at all.
Right.
So like you can't boost something that's not there necessarily. So if you add distortion, it'll kind of take the frequencies and the harmonics that are already naturally in the voice and just kind of add some high frequencies to it. Right.
So how else do you process a vocal in terms of EQ? Do you ever use 2 EQs on a vocal?
I usually have at least 2.
Really?
Yeah. So let me just run you through like a generic vocal chain.
Oh,
so
cool.
This is like my starting point. So I would record the vocal. I'd usually throw an EQ with a high-pass filter. So I'm just cutting out some low end, anywhere from like 80 to maybe like 120 or 150 K. I mean, not K, hertz.
Yeah.
And then I might throw a compressor on right after that, maybe do some really light compression just to grab some of the peaks. And then what I do on at least 90% of the vocal recordings that I record is I'll use a bus or a send and send that to a vocal return track. And that return track has another EQ on it, so that's extra. I might be cutting the lows. I have a compressor that's just annihilating everything. So it's like really harsh compression. It's meant to sound really compressed. And then I have an overdrive plugin, which is just distortion. And then I might have like some kind of limiter or something after that. So that bus channel that's really squashed, I'll mix that in with the dry vocal. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of like my dry wet knob is just raising this bus fader. So then I'll fit it in, and that really makes the vocal sound present, really brings up the really quiet parts. So it's kind of acting like, throwing a compressor on the vocal, but without, the compressor has to do less work because it's not having to deal with, I guess, the really loud parts, the really quiet parts. Just throwing it in the squashed bus chain is really bringing up everything.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. Because on my Portico 2, my Neve Portico 2 my channel strip, on the compressor, there's a, hold on, what does the knob say? Blend. So there's a blend knob on the compressor. So if it's 100%, if it's all the way to the right, it's 100% compressed signal. Mm-hmm. If I turn it back to 50%, what's coming out is 50% of the compressed signal along with 50% of the dry signal.
Yep.
So what you can do, and so you can do exactly what you're talking about. You can use the compressor to squash the living daylights out of the audio, but you only use like 5 or 10% of that hugely compressed stuff. The rest is just dry.
Yeah, it's in there really light and just mixing it into taste.
Yeah, that's a really good trick. I mean, we used to do that on drum buses as well, right? You could bus a whole drum kit and then compress I was going to say something else, but compress it a lot and then add a little bit of that back in to the vocal. It's interesting. I haven't done that in podcast production yet, but sometimes there are guests or even hosts that their track is so dynamic, sometimes they're really loud on the mic and sometimes they're really soft. And I would assume at that point it would probably help to have another like a send bus going through all kinds of stuff and adding a little bit of that back.
Yeah, that'll definitely help. Another way that you can accomplish this is kind of like manual compression, where you are going into the audio and you're just looking at the waveforms, and you can obviously tell, okay, this waveform's huge, it's really loud, and this one's really small, it's really quiet. And what I like to do is go in and I might like cut some of the really loud takes and maybe boost some of the really quiet takes, just kind of to level match them. So the compressor in general will have to do less work. Like I am reducing the dynamics, but like if you plan on doing that anyway with the compressor,
right?
This is like, it's a good way to do it manually without, stressing over the compressor not sounding perfect across the track, because it's gonna vary depending on, I guess, the really loud parts and the really quiet parts. And by manually manipulating it, it kind of evens it out for you beforehand.
Right, so you kind of level it out before the compressor so the compressor doesn't get crushed. That's happened to me so many times where there'll be some sort of vocal track, let's say it's a podcast host, and their normal volume, you can set a compressor to sound good when they're talking their normal volume. But as soon as they laugh and go, get crazy, you can hear it just gets crushed and it just sucks it in enough where it's like, it's not natural, it's a little unnatural. So what you're saying definitely removes that possibility, because it won't hit the compressor that hard. And I remember too, back in the studios when I knew engineers who they'd use a compressor a little bit, but they were guys who they would literally spend 3 hours riding the main vocal.
It just takes too long for me. I can't spend that much.
But the reason they did that is because instead of using a compressor to level out the vocal, they wanted to use their finger on a fader, because then the vocal's not so compressed. It's more natural and dynamic and vibrant, and it's not being harnessed in by a compressor. But they do make, one thing I use is a plugin called Vocal Rider. I know we've talked about it on the show a lot, actually. You can actually set your target level, Zach, and it'll actually ride the vocal the whole time. And you can actually set limits on it. So you can, only push the fader up to +1 or +2, and only bring the fader down to -1 or -2. So you can set a range. I mean, the range can be huge. You can have the fader go to +10 and -10, and it'll ride a vocal I mean, and then it can actually... Does it happen in RX5? Yeah, RX5 does it. I'm sure there's plugins that do it. It'll actually write those volume changes into the volume level of the track.
Oh.
So all the lines that, like, when you move the fader up and down, and it writes that automation line, it'll write that whole line for you for the whole track. Yeah, so RX5 does that, and I know Vocal Rider does it as a plugin. I'm not sure if Vocal Rider writes it into automation. It might, I'm not sure, but I just use it as a plugin. So I process my audio, and actually the last step is it goes through the Vocal Rider, and I have it set at, I don't even know what, minus 17 dB. You know, that's my target, whatever, some target. And so I on each track, on each speaker in the podcast, I use the Vocal Rider set to the same target. So then it's continually riding all the speakers to be at that one level.
I've never heard of that Vocal Rider plugin. I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, sometimes it's on sale. Otherwise, I think normally the price is a little bit high, but every now and then it's on sale and you can get it.
I have a what's called a Personas fader port, which is just like it's a motorized single fader. It has a bunch of other knobs and switches too, but I mostly use it for just the fader. And I'll kind of do a similar thing where I might run through the vocal once or twice and kind of ride the gain a little bit. So if I know a part is really quiet, I might, ride the gain up, or if I know a part's really loud, I'll ride the gain down. It's similar to what I was saying about the manual compression, except, again, yeah, you're just automating. But that takes a lot of practice to get used to as well.
Oh, yeah, right. Riding a vocal with your hand that's an art. But and imagine before there was automation, right? When all the guys, like the whole band standing around the board, everyone's got their hand on 4 faders, and it's like you got to fade and cut, and it's like a whole orchestration of them to come up to do one mix. And then if you screw it up, you got to go back and do it all again. Poor guys. Of course, in 30 years, they're going to say that about us. They're going to be like, can you believe these idiots talking about plugins and and worrying about levels and compression? What's wrong with them? So funny. All right, so we talked a lot about EQ. I'm glad we went through your vocal chain. That actually helps a lot. Just real quick, though, talk to me about chorus as an effect. Because I don't know anyone in podcasting that uses chorus, but I would think like the little bit of distortion that you add, the very slight bit of distortion, you could probably add a very slight bit of chorus just to beef it up. What do you think?
Yeah, I do. That's also on my my vocal chain. I didn't bring it up because I don't use it all the time. Okay. But I use Isotope Nectar.
Okay.
Which is it has a whole bunch of stuff that it can do. One of the big reasons I use it for is like the chorus part of it. There's a harmony module inside, and you can pitch voices up or down. So a lot of time, what I'll do is like for some rap artists, a big thing now is where you triple the voice and you have one voice an octave up, one voice an octave down, and that both of those are blended into the dry vocal. Oh. It's a really neat effect. But it's really subtle. So I'll do stuff like that, or sometimes I'll just have the exact same vocal 3 times, so like a unison voice, and I'll just kind of delay the time or the pitch on each side. So it's like it's like chorus. It's a very slight chorus effect, and I'll like really lightly mix it in there.
Got it. Right. So what you're talking about is you have one track recorded, one voice on one track, and then you actually copy that same track onto 2 other tracks. So now you have 3. And on the second and third tracks, you can actually slide it a few milliseconds, either forward or back, but then really just add a little bit of that in, right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So there's plugins that'll do this for you. I like to do it manually a lot of the time, not all the time. Depends on how much time I have for the mix. I might just throw a quick chorus plugin on just to see how it sounds, or just so that the artist can hear it. But yeah, it's a really cool effect. Really makes the song wider, makes the vocal wider, like just fill up the space.
Right. Interesting. You just mentioned wider, and I'm just thinking that a lot of podcasts are produced into mono. So it's interesting. Yeah, you probably never mixed to mono, right?
Not Regularly.
You might monitor through mono. I remember in the studios we had like a little, what was it? A little speaker, a little Oratone. It was a little Oratone speaker, little tiny guy right in the center, in mono. And these mix engineers, every now and then, like maybe once every hour, they would literally turn the volume way down and put it on this Oratone, and literally you'd have to be really quiet as the assistant engineer. You can't be shuffling papers, and at that point, shut up, because the engineer's listening at a low volume in mono, and it's really handy for mixing. Changing volumes, right? Changing volumes when you're mixing, and also hearing it through different speakers is really handy.
I don't like to change too much. Yeah, I have a, what is it? Trying to remember the name. The Persona Central Station. So it's a passive attenuator. So I can send the output of my interface into this control station, and it lets me have 3 sets of speakers, so A, B, and C, and I can swap between them and listen on my main monitors, maybe some smaller speakers, or I actually have one of those small Oratone speakers, like the mono cubes, and I try to check every mix in that. I'll set it to, there's a mono button on there, and I'll just check out the whole mix and see how it sounds. That's like to replicate like a cell phone kind of thing.
Right.
Like a really shitty speaker.
Right. And that's the thing. A lot of people they'll listen to a podcast, and not always, but they'll have their phone, and they'll put their phone, like they'll just play the MP3 on their phone and just turn up the volume. And it's just the speaker from their phone playing it, which of course has virtually no low end at all.
Yeah. But that's what people are listening on. Phones and like really, I don't know, horrible Apple earbuds.
Right. And that's exactly why the mid-range in a mix, the mid-range is the most important, because then if you listen to it on a phone or nice big speakers, the mid-range is balanced and mixed well. It'll hold up on any speaker, right?
Yeah.
Boom. All right, so let's talk about compression. So compression is, again, something that a lot of podcast producers, and most podcasters, don't even use. And look, I'm not condemning anyone for that. I'm saying that's why we're here to talk about it, so we can all learn to use it, because it's not hard to use. I find instead of compression, many podcasters or podcast producers just use, for instance, a limiter. Like they'll put it through Auphonic and just which doesn't do compression, does limiting, and it kind of evens it out. And yes, it does make it louder, but it doesn't do what a compressor does. So let's talk about compression. What do you tell me your feelings about compression on a voice?
Pretty much, yes. Every single track has some form of compression on it. Even if the voice is level, just compression adds a certain, I guess, I don't know, clarity to it. It adds a certain presence that just sounds nice. And pretty much everything we're hearing now has some kind of compression or some kind of work on it, whether it's like a radio or a TV show, or like, so we're so used to that sound now that when I don't hear compression on a vocal, if I heard a podcast that's just dry, like I would be able to tell, because like I guess the voice would be all over the place. The dynamics would be yucky.
Totally. I hear that too. Without compression, voices sound further away, and you can turn up the volume or put up the fader, but they still sound like they're further away. To me, a compressor just brings it up into the front and more in your face, and which means that it's more clear, which means that it'll stand above any background noise. Like if you're washing dishes, for instance, you're listening to a podcast washing dishes, you have the dishes clanking, you have the water running.
Yep.
A compressed voice is in your face enough, it's close enough that it'll rise above the kitchen sink noises more easily. If you did not compress it, it would kind of go in and out, and you'd have to crank up your earbuds really loud, and that's not comfortable either.
Yeah.
All right, so compressor, you use compression on everything, which I think I do too.
Well, most things. Or if I'm not using compression, I'm still sending it to some kind of, like, even if I don't put a compressor on like drums and stuff, I'm still sending it most of the time to a bus that has like that squash compression I was talking about, parallel compression.
Right.
So even if I'm not using a compressor directly, most of the time there is some form of compression on everything that I'm doing.
Okay, so let's talk about the three of the most important knobs on a compressor: the attack, the release, and the ratio. Talk to me about those.
Well, not every compressor is going to have those three knobs. I have a compressor that just has an input and an output, and then it just depends on how much you're sending to it is how much it compresses. So if you send more signal to it, it's going to compress more.
Right. So, but as that unit compresses, it does have an internal attack and release and ratio, but it's either fixed or it's dependent on the signal going through it, right? A lot of these compressors, it's like auto release. It's like it'll, depending on what sound comes through, it'll somehow automatically change the release to be optimal.
And that's something I use a lot, like auto release. Like a lot of compressors that have some auto feature definitely helps out. Release is a bit tricky sometimes. I just use auto whenever it's available to me. Otherwise, I'm just playing around with the release, making sure I don't get like a pumping sound.
Right. And actually, I have the compressors I have, the DBX 166s. I have a bunch of them right in front of me. I use them on the inserts of my mixer just for recording podcast, for the recording phase of podcasting. Because sometimes when you're recording people, if they really get loud and then they really get soft, it's actually hard to get a good recording level on the hard drive because you have to turn the gain down for when they're loud, and then when they're soft, it's recording at such a low resolution. Later on, it gets all distorted and pixely and whatever. So I actually, not everyone, but some speakers, I will actually compress them a little bit to tape. And a little bit meaning I use these DBX 166s, and they have two knobs on here, which makes it easy. There's an auto knob that you can push for the attack and release. So that automatic attack and release, it's in auto mode. And you still have to pick your ratio, which I just usually leave it at 4-1, which is kind of...
That's not bad, yeah.
Kind of in the middle there. And then it also has an over easy button, which over easy is like, it's not going to, squash the signal. It's going to,
That's more of a knee. You know what a knee is?
Yeah, the knee,
So like the ratio and the knee have a relationship.
Right, the knee. So the knee is how fast that the compression kicks in, basically, right? Yeah. So that's
I'm trying to remember like the actual definition of it. Like I learned all of this stuff and was quizzed on it.
I know.
But don't tell my teachers.
So basically the over easy switch on the DBX 166, and other DBXs have this too, the over easy switch. But if you're using the over easy, it'll like kind of ease into the compression. Like otherwise the compressor's just going to slam on and be more noticeable. That's basically what it is. Yeah,
I use the over easy for things like maybe more vocals, where I might turn off the over easy for things like drums, where I want it to be, I guess, more sudden and harsh. I'm not worried about cranking it a bit more.
Right, totally. Okay, so you do use several compressors where literally it's just input and output, which is kind of cool because those types of plugins, those types of compressors, they have a certain character to them, right? Yeah, I like it because you're not thinking about, like I have so many different compressors. I have compressors that do have attack, release, ratio, and every other, I guess, knob that you'd want to change. But you're so, I guess, fixated on getting the perfect sound and listening over and over again, where some of these old analog gear just have an input and output, or maybe just, a threshold and I guess a ratio or something. Whatever.
Yeah, it's some really basic stuff, and they take care of it for you, where you're forced to use your ears more versus your eyes and looking at how much is actually being reduced and what's going on. I like forcing myself to use my ears. Yeah, well, we all know that that's the real test of any audio processing is your ear. Yeah, so it doesn't matter what the knobs look like on a compressor. If it sounds good, then boom, that's perfect. I like those old LA2As. They had literally two knobs, big knobs too, like as big as a little smaller than the palm of your hand. There's two huge knobs on this thing, and the big VU meter right in the middle. I'd love to own one of those. I think Paul McCartney
with the Beatles used that, and I think he used 2 of them in series. So, and just, or was it that or a Pultec? No, he used a Pultec EQ with an LA2A. I think I think that's how they processed his bass guitar. I mean, look, maybe it was just one song or one album, or I don't know, but that's what I heard through the grapevine. But those are some serious old, fat-sounding analog pieces of gear. Jeez. Hey, question for you about that, plugins and stuff. Since I was out of the audio game for, let's say, about 10 years, and then plugins came along, and now I see all these plugins are saying, ooh, this is the LA2A plugin. Like, do the plugins of the classic gear, do they really sound like the classic gear, or is it like they're trying to do their best and that kind of thing?
I've heard I don't have the LA2A actual plugin. I've heard really good things that it sounds very similar. I mean, there's no way it's going to sound exactly the way the real LA2A sounds, but that's thousands of dollars, and I don't have money for that.
Right.
But I've heard really good things. I am interested in actually picking one of those up. I've been meaning to.
Right, jeez. I need to win the lottery for all these plugins I wanted to. Hey, by the way, on the Ozone 7, on the Isotope Ozone 7, the mastering software, they now, I don't know if they have it in Ozone 6, but they have this, it's like a tape bias module where you can actually, it's almost like, I mean, the way I understand it is like if you were recording your mix onto a 1/2-inch tape and then getting it back off the playback head just to add that fatness and the bias of tape. And you can add a little low end, a little high end. It's not an EQ. It's just like accents almost. It's just a little.
Yeah, that sounds really good. I've actually done that with an old cassette tape machine where like I recorded some. I wanted to get like a old retro sound, So I took the whole mix, threw it on to this cassette, and then recorded it back from cassette into my DAW. And it adds like its own, I guess, compression, its own warmth and saturation in a way that just sounds really good.
Yeah, that's why I like the Ozone 7, because you can, you can use the multiband compressor. This is what I have now. I'm using a multiband compressor. Then it goes into the analog bias thing. Then it goes to a limiter. And actually, I think that's the only 3 I'm using. I don't EQ the master because, like I said, I mix each episode like a mix. So I'm actually EQing everything and balancing everything. So and look, it's for podcasting. It's not like for, a Jay-Z album or something. So I'm not going to sit there and fine tune, the difference between 47 hertz and 58 hertz and all the, whatever. But I'm digging the Ozone 7. Anyway, I'm going to do a whole episode on that. So other than that, for compression, you said in your vocal chain, when you're processing your lead vocals, when you produce music, that you use an EQ with a high-pass filter first, then you use a compressor with sort of light compression. Now, what do you mean by light compression, and how do you set that? So I have basic compressor settings where I might put the ratio anywhere from like 3 to 4. Just going to throw out some settings here. Sure.
Attack around, I guess, 17 milliseconds. Release anywhere from like 70, or I usually put it around auto. And I just leave that as, I guess, the default for vocal compression.
Okay.
And then from there, I'll work around and just play with it to make sure everything sounds good. A lot of, like, I'll make sure I'll put manual makeup gain, so I'm not pushing the makeup button. I'm adding a few dB. And I'll sit there and I'll compare and contrast. I'll turn the compressor on, turn it off, and just see what the difference is. See if it's making it sound the way I want it. If it is sounding more present. If it is, or is it taking away from the vocal? You have to listen to it in the whole mix, listen to it by itself.
Totally. Yeah, so 17 milliseconds attack. The attack setting is something I mess with quite often. I think normally, I start with it around 30.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. Sometimes if someone is really like, if their S's are sharp, or if they're just like, there's some sharpness to their, the T's and the, if it's sharp, if it's feeling sharp, of course you can use a de-esser if that's what you need. But sometimes I'll bring the attack down to probably where you have it, 17 or 15 or 13. And that'll actually bring down some of those really sharp transients if they're too much. So it'll
30 milliseconds is really good too. That's another, I guess, default that I use for other compressors. Just right now, it's anywhere from 17 to 30 is usually where as far as vocal attack goes, is where I lay.
Right. Yeah, the attack is interesting because if you set it too high, like if you set it to 100, the first part of every word or every sentence is going to be like, it's just going to feel sharp, like there's something poking you through the speaker, and then the compressor kicks in. So it's like the nuances of the attack setting are good to know and handy to use if, because look, a lot of times the T's and the S's, they're sharp. And so if you bring the attack down, that'll just help a little bit, and then you can use a de-esser as well, and then you're good.
Yeah. Yeah, de-essers are really good.
Yeah, tell me about de-essers real quick, and then we got to go, actually. Dang it.
De-essers are basically like compressors with like a sidechain built in where it's listening to certain frequencies. So it might be listening to, I think my de-esser by default, it's listening from 7 to 14 kilohertz. So whenever it detects like a really loud signal above the threshold, it's just you can either have it just attenuate the high end or attenuate the entire track, the entire vocal track as a whole, all the frequencies. Yeah, it works really well.
Yeah, and a classic de-esser, right, it'll just attenuate those high frequencies so that the S's are not as sharp. That's awesome. Yeah, very handy. Very handy. Well, Zack, this has been awesome, man. Soma Recording Studios. I know you have a website, right?
Yeah, it's just somarecordingstudios.com.
There you go. SOMA. Soma Recording Studios. It'll be in the show notes. And, of course, people can go to your website and check that out. Zack, we got to talk again because the time just flew by and there's more to talk about. So
yeah, absolutely. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, we'll figure out when you can come back. I really appreciate you coming on. I think your perspective from a non-podcaster viewpoint is actually really helpful.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
Yeah, because it just brings in color. Like podcasters talk to other podcasters and all that, but it's good to have, especially when we're talking about audio quality, good to have a music engineer come in and put their 2 cents in or 10 cents or whatever you put in. So this has been awesome. Zack Hanni, thank you so much. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you next time. And as always, sound great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You walk away from me and you can't play that part so well. Why do you play it out on me now? You like to lose control where it's quite a feeling, isn't it? They're floating, drifting down now. You tell me that you found something better. How should I respond to that? It's a lie. I don't wanna hear it. What do you want me to say? It's a lie. I don't wanna hear it. You react some everything. You change your attitude where you say I just don't get it now. You say your eyes so far away now. You gave up on me where some chance you gave me gave away. You say I wouldn't understand now. You tell me that you found something better. How should I respond to that? Oh yeah, I say now it's a lie. I don't wanna hear it. What do you want me to say? It's a lie. I don't wanna hear it. You react so angry. I want you to know you will ever with me through. I gone over all we've been through. Doesn't seem that long a time now. Think we can still hold that meaning. It doesn't mean it's still the same. You're pushing me away. You worked your theories now where you're getting worked up. it hurts me now that you don't talk to me now that these worlds have split apart now. You tell me that you found something better. How should I